The executioner's axe never fell on Richard III, not because he escaped, not because someone showed mercy, but because on the morning of August 22, 1485, at a muddy field in Leicestershire, England, the last Plantagenet king of England charged directly into the heart of the enemy line alone, on horseback, at full gallop, trying to cut down Henry Tudor with his own hand before the battle was lost. He almost made it. You can picture it, the ground churned to soup by the hooves of 1,000 horses, the screaming of men who didn't want to be there, the smell of blood and horse sweat thick enough to taste, and at the center of it all, a king not hiding behind his generals, not retreating to fight another day, riding straight into death because he decided that was better than the alternative. They found his body face down in the mud, stripped, humiliated, slung over a horse like a sack of grain and paraded through Leicester. For the next 5 centuries, historians, playwrights, and Tudor propagandists called him a monster, a child killer, a hunchbacked villain so evil that Shakespeare made him the template for pure theatrical malevolence. But here's the thing about history. Sometimes the winners write it so well that the lie lasts 500 years. Until now, let's start with what you think you know about Richard III. You know the hunchback? You know the withered arm? You know the sinister limp and the poisonous smile and the opening soliloquy, "I am determined to prove a villain that generations of English students had to memorize." You know he murdered his 2 young nephews, the princes in the Tower, and seized the throne through naked treachery. That's the Richard III that entered the cultural bloodstream, the one painted by Thomas More, polished by Polydore Virgil, and then immortalized forever by William Shakespeare around 1593. The villain's villain, the gold standard of medieval evil. Here's what's fascinating. Almost none of it was written by eyewitnesses. Thomas More was 7 years old when Richard died. He wrote his biography of Richard decades later, almost entirely based on sources loyal to the Tudor dynasty that had every reason to blacken Richard's name. Polydore Virgil was an Italian scholar hired directly by Henry VII, Richard's conqueror, to write the official history of England, and Shakespeare. Shakespeare was writing under Elizabeth I, Henry VII's granddaughter. Saying nice things about the man her grandfather replaced wasn't exactly a career move. You are watching history being manufactured in real time. The physical deformity is the most telling detail. For 500 years, the hunchback was taken as fact, a visual shorthand for inner evil, the body betraying the soul. Medieval audiences understood that language, a twisted spine, meant a twisted character. It was propaganda, dressed as biology. Then, in 2012, archaeologists dug up a parking lot in Leicester, literally a parking lot, and underneath the asphalt, they found a skeleton. The skeleton had scoliosis, a lateral curvature of the spine. Significant? Yes. Debilitating? No. Modern medical analysis confirmed that Richard would have appeared slightly asymmetrical at the shoulder, possibly one shoulder marginally higher than the other. He would not have had a dramatic hump. He would not have had a withered arm. He likely walked and rode without visible difficulty. He was, in other words, a functional human being who got turned into a cartoon monster by the people who killed him. Dry observation. Tudor PR was remarkably effective for an era without social media. So if the physical story was exaggerated, what about the moral one? What was Richard III actually like before Shakespeare got hold of him? The answer is going to make you uncomfortable because it makes the story much more complicated than a simple villain. To understand Richard III, you have to understand what it meant to be the younger brother of Edward IV of England. You are born in 1452, the 11th child of Richard, Duke of York. Your father dies in battle when you are 8 years old. Your eldest brother seizes the throne and becomes Edward IV, and you are now a royal Duke Richard, Duke of Gloucester, with all the wealth and responsibility that entails, and none of the security in medieval England. Being close to the throne without being on it is one of the most dangerous places you can stand. You grow up in an era where loyalty is currency And betrayal is the most common transaction. Your brother George, Duke of Clarence, switches sides twice during the Wars of the Roses, first fighting against Edward, then returning, then plotting again. In 1478, Edward has George executed famously, according to legend, drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Your own brother, by your own family's order. You watch this happen. You learn what disloyalty costs, what the historical record shows, not Tudor record, but contemporary record, including accounts from people who had no stake in the Tudor narrative, is a Richard who was, by the standards of his time, a competent and fair administrator. As Lord of the North under Edward IV, he governed Yorkshire with enough effectiveness that the region genuinely mourned him after his death. That's not Tudor propaganda. That's letters. That's local records. He reformed the Council of the North, making legal proceedings more accessible to ordinary people, not out of sentimentality, but because functional governance was good politics. He was known for paying his debts, which in the 15th century was unusual enough to be remarked upon. He was, by multiple contemporary accounts, personally brave. The charge at Bosworth wasn't a moment of desperation. It was consistent with a pattern. He was also deeply religious in a way that went beyond performance. He founded chantries, endowed colleges, and showed particular devotion to institutions that would pray for souls, including the souls of his enemies. That's not the behavior of someone who thought of himself as a villain. Does any of this prove he didn't murder the princes in the tower? No. We'll get to that. It's genuinely the hardest question, but it means the man who walked into the most consequential decision of his life in 1483 was not a scheming monster who had spent decades building toward treachery. He was a competent royal duke who suddenly found himself at the edge of a catastrophe he didn't create, and the catastrophe was about to swallow everything. Edward IV dies on April 9. He is 40 years old. Nobody saw it coming. You are Richard, Duke of Gloucester. In the north of England, when the news arrives, your brother, the king, the man who gave your life structure and purpose and safety, is dead. His heir is Edward V, his 12-year-old son, and in London, the Queen's family, the Woodvilles, are already moving to control the boy king and, through him, the entire government. This is the moment everything accelerates. The Woodvilles were not popular. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had always been controversial. She was a widow, a commoner by the standards of high nobility, and her large family had flooded the court with relatives hungry for titles and influence. They were powerful, well-positioned, and universally resented by the old nobility. Richard intercepts young Edward V's escort on the road to London. He takes custody of the boy. He arrests the Queen's brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. He writes to the council explaining that he is protecting the king from those who would use him for factional purposes. Was he, or was he already planning to take the throne himself? Here's where historians have spent 5 centuries arguing, and here's where the recent scholarship gets genuinely interesting. The evidence suggests Richard's move against the Woodvilles was not initially a plan for usurpation. It was a power play for the regency control of the government during a royal minority, which was both legal and, given the Woodville threat, arguably justified. Several members of the council supported him. Lord Hastings, one of the most powerful men in England and a loyal Edward IV man, initially backed Richard. Then something shifted. In June 1483, Richard had Hastings arrested at a council meeting and executed the same day. No trial, no formal charges, just gone. That was the moment the calculus changed. That was not the behavior of a man confident in his legal position. That was fear. 3 weeks later, Richard presented Parliament with a petition arguing that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid based on a claim that Edward had been pre-contracted to another woman before the marriage. If the marriage was invalid, Edward V was illegitimate. And if Edward V was illegitimate, The next legitimate male heir was Richard himself. Parliament accepted the argument. Richard was crowned Richard III on July 6. by Bashasan. The two princes disappeared into the Tower of London and were never seen again. What happened to them in that tower is the question that has haunted English history for 500 years, and the answer is far stranger than you've been told. This is the part where you have to sit with uncertainty, because that's all the honest evidence allowed. Edward V. and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were last reliably reported alive in the summer of 1483. After that, nothing. No confirmed sightings. No records of their deaths. No bodies that have been definitively identified. Two boys between 9 and 12 years old, inside the most fortified structure in England, simply ceased to appear in the historical record. The Tudor narrative, the one you absorb through Shakespeare, is straightforward. Richard III had them murdered, almost certainly by Sir James Tyrrell, sometime in the summer of 1483. This version was written down by Thomas More, who claimed to have heard a confession from Tyrrell before his execution in 1502. More's account is detailed, dramatic, and almost entirely unverifiable. Here's what recent historians have found when they actually examine the evidence. First, Tyrrell's alleged confession doesn't appear in any contemporary record from 1502. It appears in More's manuscript, written 15 to 20 years after the fact. More himself never finished the manuscript. It was published posthumously. The chain of custody on this confession is, to put it charitably, weak. 2nd Henry VII, after taking the throne, never officially accused Richard III of murdering the princes. This is strange. If you have just defeated a child murderer and taken his throne in the name of justice, you publicize the crime. You use it. Henry VII didn't. He attainted Richard for treason but never formally charged him with the princes' deaths. Some historians read this as Henry not actually knowing what happened or knowing something he couldn't publicly say. Third, there were other people with motive. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, who initially supported Richard and then dramatically rebelled against him in late 1483, had his own claim to the throne and his own reasons to want the princes gone. Henry Tudor himself, before he became Henry VII, needed the Yorkist line discredited. The prince's death served multiple parties. Does this exonerate Richard? No. Occam's razor still points at the man who had the most immediate control of the tower and the most immediate reason to want the boys permanently out of the picture. But it means the certainty with which history convicted him was never warranted. In 2021, a team of historians and forensic experts formally petitioned for DNA testing of bones found in the tower in 1674, long assumed to be the princes. The petition is still being considered. We may get an answer. We may not. The mystery that defined Richard III's reputation for 5 centuries might not be solvable by evidence, only by probability. And probability, as any lawyer will tell you, is not the same as guilt. But here's what no one talks about. The rehabilitation of Richard III's reputation raises a question that's even more uncomfortable than his guilt. Let's step back from the 15th century for a moment and look at what actually happened here. A dynasty won a battle. They hired writers. Those writers produced a narrative so effective, so dramatically satisfying, so well crafted, that it survived for 500 years. Shaped the work of the greatest playwright in the English language, and became the default understanding of a real human being who was no longer around to object. Richard III never got a trial. He never got a defense. He got Shakespeare. Now, in the 21st century, forensic archaeology, DNA analysis, and historians willing to read primary sources without Tudor-tinted glasses are slowly dismantling a story that generations took as settled fact. What does that mean for how we consume history? Here's the uncomfortable parallel: the tools that the Tudors used controlling the narrative. Delegitimizing the opposition. Repeating the story until repetition becomes truth are not medieval inventions. They are permanent features of power. Every generation produces its own versions of Polydore Virgil, Every era has people paid to write history in a way that serves whoever is currently in charge. The Richard III case is extreme because it lasted so long, and because Shakespeare made it so vivid. But the mechanism is not extreme. The mechanism is standard. What Richard III's rehabilitation incomplete, contested, still ongoing teaches you is that the confidence with which history is delivered is almost never proportional to the quality of the evidence behind it. The story that sounds the most certain, the most dramatically satisfying, the most morally clean, is often the one that has been worked on the hardest. The skeleton under the parking lot in Leicester had scoliosis, not a hunchback. The man buried there rode a horse into battle at 42 years old. He was killed by multiple blows, including one that sheared off the back of his skull, the kind of wound you get when you've lost your helmet in a cavalry charge. Still fighting, he died violently, in the middle of a battle, swinging his sword. That's not the death of a scheming, craven villain. That's something considerably more complicated. And here, before we close, I genuinely want to hear from you. What do you think? Does the new evidence change your view of Richard III, or does the disappearance of the princes still feel like a line he can't be forgiven for crossing? Regardless of anything else, drop your answer in the comment. I read every single one, and the debates in this community are genuinely some of the most interesting conversations I have. The answer to that question matters not just for Richard III, but for how you decide to trust any story that's been told to you with absolute confidence. Go back to that field in Leicestershire. August 20 Shidoi. by Bashawu. The mud, the smell, the noise. Richard III sees Henry Tudor across the battlefield. He makes a decision that historians once read as the act of a desperate, cornered criminal, a man who had run out of options and was choosing death over surrender. But look at it again. Through everything you now know, here is a man who governed fairly, who paid his debts, who charged into battle personally rather than hiding behind others, who made a catastrophic political decision in 1483 under pressure that would have broken most people, and who spent the next 2 years ruling a kingdom that was genuinely divided about whether he was legitimate. The charge at Bosworth wasn't madness. It was the last coherent act of someone who understood that the alternative capture, imprisonment, the slow erosion of everything he had built, his story told entirely by the people who defeated him, was worse than a clean death on a battlefield. He was right about that. At least, they told his story anyway. It took 500 years, a parking lot, and a team of forensic archaeologists to start setting the record straight. Before I go, this video covered a lot of ground, and I'd genuinely love to know what surprised you most. Was it the physical evidence, the Tudor propaganda machine, or the unresolved question of the princes? Leave a comment, even a short one, helps this channel reach more people who love history. And your perspective genuinely shapes what I cover next. The bones under the asphalt don't speak, but 5 centuries later, they finally made someone listen.